claims they offer. Now, on questions of practicality, one of the things that you hear often in these debates is simply that you know, well, free market anarchism, that sounds all right in theory. You know, that's a great idea, but it's never going to happen anytime soon. That's an impractical proposition. Sometimes people think that it's an impractical proposition for the short term, that, you know, there's just no way to bring it about right now. Other times people will argue that there's no way ever to bring it about, that it will always be impractical because, you know, they can't figure out how to make defense services work on a free market, or you know, to make roads work the way they want them to work, or any number of other weird things that people come up with. What I want to say is to just look at the actual alternatives that we have here, because the question is not just how practical is anarchy, although that's important, and you can talk about that, but also how practical is the proposed alternative, right? If the practicality argument is supposed to defeat anarchism, but it turns out that you don't have any alternative but a repeatedly failed strategy, then you haven't yet given any reason to disfavor anarchism and to favor limited government over it. And I think that, in fact, if you look at the historical backdrop, you'll see there's very good reason to think that limited government has always and everywhere been a miserably failed strategy for achieving individual liberty, for defending against government invasions of liberty. The favorite examples that are often brought up in sort of an American libertarian context are things like, you know, the United States Constitution as an example of limited government or minimal government. Well, the US Constitution is not actually an example of minimal government, and it's never been an example of minimal government. If you somehow manage to get the US Constitution interpreted exactly the way that sort of the framers intended for it to be interpreted, you'd still have a government that's imposing commercial monopolies on patents, that's taxing on tariffs at a minimum, and I think also a large number of other taxes that some people think aren't authorized, but I think are by the Constitution, but that are immoral whether constitutional or not. And if you look at the history of the Constitution, right? I mean, people will say, "Oh, well, it's awful now," but, you know, back in Madison's day, back in Jefferson's day, the Constitution was a much better example of minimal government than it is now. Really? I mean, the Constitution in Jefferson's and Madison's day, or back when it was first framed, was created to expand the power of the central government to tax. It was created to expand the power of central government to protect slavery. And it created to expand the power of the government to control the allocation of Western lands for politically favored interests, right? The Constitution didn't just kind of emerge immediately out of the revolutionary situation in America. It was created specifically in order to replace the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation had their own problems, but my view of what their problems were is that it was too much government, right? Whereas the explicit view of the people who were framing the Constitution was that it wasn't enough government, that you should have more government to pass fugitive slave laws and to impose uniform tariffs across the country, and to control the distribution of land in the Western territories. So although it's actually, I think, a terrible example of minimal government, you might say that it is an attempt at limited government, right? It tries to limit government to something that's bigger than the minimum, but there are attempts to build in procedural limits there, sure. There's a system of checks and balances, there's a system of vetoing, and there's a number of other systems which serve to try and restrain government from simply growing into arbitrary dictates. But how's that worked out for us? Where are we now? Hell, where were we in 1830, 1840, 1850 when the people citing the Constitution most, Southern slave owners who were citing it because of the importance of the Fugitive Slave Act to them, were citing it first of all in defense of chattel slavery, but also just in defense of you know, postal gag orders in order to suppress abolitionist literature from being sent into the South, who were using it to justify expansionist warfare and repeated invasions of civil liberties in order to maintain the system of privilege that they felt that the Constitution was created to protect. This is a system of limiting government where all the limits were broke down within a matter of a couple decades, at best, and that wasn't that great to begin with. Well, what about other potential examples of limited government? Well, there's the Articles of Confederation that I just talked about. How'd that work out? We ended up with the Constitution. There's also, there's other historical examples. The English Bill of Rights in the wake of the revolutions against monarchical power in England. Well, wait a few decades and you've got exactly the kind of intolerable situation that produced the American Revolution. So you actually have a series of failed attempts to limit government, and every time it fails, people come in and try and develop a new limited government that's going to replace the old one. You can go on and multiply the examples. The Roman Republic, some of the features of what's called Athenian democracy, which actually had a lot of procedural factors built in to try and restrain the arbitrary authority of governmental institutions, but which time and time again have proven that as long as the set of limits, whether these are written out limits or whether they're just sort of traditional understood limits in either a paper constitution or a traditional constitution, that are supposed to hold back government, will never hold back government as long as it's government courts and government bodies themselves that have final authority over determining where those limits fall and what those limits mean. The only solution, if you're serious about limiting government, is to create a situation in which you take away the government monopoly on legal interpretation and also the government monopoly on legal enforcement, since an unenforceable limit is no limit at all. That's just talking about what you'd like. But if you're actually after getting rid of the government monopoly on legal interpretation and the government monopoly on legal enforcement, then what you're talking about is not limited government. It's anarchy. You've removed sovereignty and made the government simply one sort of defense agency. So one agency tasked with defending people's rights, among many, in a open, fully competitive, freely competitive, and fully accountable free market for defense. And I think that this has a number of impacts down the line, especially in terms of political strategy and political affiliations. So if you begin to think of yourself as an anarchist, you begin to think of what you're doing not as trying to recover some limited government that existed in the past, but trying to bring out something new that hasn't existed before in human history, and that promises a form of liberation that we haven't ever yet seen. And also, if you look at the example of our forebearers, of people like the Wobblies, the second lesson that you can learn from the Wobblies in Spokane, I think that this produces some real changes in terms of how we think of ourselves politically, and in particular, how we think of ourselves in relation to the left and to the right. Now, the Wobblies, as I said, were radical unionists. They were labor organizers. They weren't labor organizers who depended on government bureaucracy in order to get done what they were trying to get done. But they were out for common workers and saw themselves as opposed to the interests of big business and the employing class. And so they saw themselves fundamentally as people of the left, people of the radical left in particular. And I think that libertarianism is, in fact, properly understood, should be understood not as a movement of the right, not as something that has come out of American conservatism or traditionalism or sort of the rightist attempt to hold back social transformation, but rather a movement that comes out of the left, because liberty, in fact, is not a conservative idea, but a left-wing idea. What do I mean by that? Well, go back to the history of the terms. The terms left and right are actually their French equivalents. First started being used to apply to politics after the French Revolution in the context of the French National Assembly. And it started out as just a seating chart. So, you had the French National Assembly and they'd get together and debate about stupid government things. And when they got together for these debates, they tended to sort of sort themselves out by political views. And the way it worked out was that the people who sat on the right were generally defenders of the old order, the ancien regime. So in sort of the middle right, you had people who supported constitutional monarchy. Further right, you had people who supported sort of unreconstructed absolute monarchy. At the furthest right, you had the people who believed that there could be no limits on government whatsoever, that government could do nothing wrong because what government said was by definition right, because the power of government, the power of the king, was established by God Almighty himself as his instrument upon earth. And these are the folks who are often said to be more royalist than the king.